Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me as always is Ken. How you doing, Ken?
Exceptionally well, delighted to be here as always. Thank you for joining us on the Counselling Tutor Podcast. You've joined us at episode 141. We got three topics, exciting topics we're looking to dive into today. The first one is we're going to be having a chat about what integrative counselling is. Now that's difficult for me to say integrative. I don't know why it is, but the tongue does not flow well around the word integrative. But we're going to be looking at what that is. Then we're going to have our check-in with CPCAB, where we're speaking about standardising of assessment levels. Rory, you met up with Heather to discuss this. What can we expect from that?
Well, we're going to be talking about, it's basically pulling the curtain back on awarding bodies and seeing why standardisation is so important. So if someone is doing a qualification in Bath and someone is doing a qualification in, say, Birmingham, the qualification is standardised. And I'm going to be talking, you'll hear Heather talk a little bit about why it gives people like employers comfort to know there's a standardised assessment.
Looking forward to that one. And then we're going to be ending with delving into practice matters, which is kind of where we look at elements of practice. And we're going to be speaking about management of endings. I know that endings are one of the biggest complaints that is levied at the BACP here in the UK. So endings can be tricky. There are different kinds of endings, so we're going to be exploring those. But let's start off with what is integrative. You see, I can't say integrative. I've just got to say it slowly. Counselling, Rory.
Well, I think it's a good question, and I think if you to ask a number of therapists, you probably get a number of answers. And in fact, it is a question that's been asked on our Facebook page quite a lot. So if you want to join our Facebook community, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. It's a closed group, knock on the door. Of course, we're going to let you in, and you will meet thousands and thousands of like-minded people, students of counselling and psychotherapy, qualified colleagues, supervisors, some trainers, all talking about the world of counselling. And this has come up on a few occasions recently, as well as in my post bag. What does integrative really mean? Well, on a very basic level, it's a blend of two theories. So during the 1990s, theorists believed that it would be useful to blend the very best of, say, one theory, person-centered, and a cognitive theory, and put them together. So it's really a blending of two theories. And if we think of why blending two theories, well, sometimes clients want a bit more. You know, if you're a person-centered therapist, sometimes clients want strategies. They come with specific issues that they want to resolve. And the integrative approach is thought to be able to help people with maybe more strategy. So, for instance, a person-centered therapist may very well work with the emotions and what's going on and the lived experience. CBT therapist may work with the kind of difficulties and structures and how to approach the kind of thinking that you may be going through and how to alter your thinking. And by blending those two in, you get a therapy where someone feels heard, listened to, accepted, but also a client may want some strategies. A classic example is someone who may be fearing of flying or has a difficulty with groups of people, and that might be more of a structured-based approach where you're asking the client to do little experiments. You know, okay, so why don't you try to go in for a little while? What could happen? What's the worst that could happen? That type of thing, and getting the client to do their own little experiments. So that's why you blend them together.
Yeah, so it is. It's a blending. As opposed to kind of, I guess, just sticking things together that might not work. It's not a toolbox of just using what kind of feels right at the time. It is a studied discipline, I guess. So I've got a little definition here for it. An integrative approach to counselling and psychotherapy involves drawing upon more than one modality, the blending of relevant theory and interventions in the approach to suit the needs of the client. So it really does involve having an understanding of those modalities, and the difference between integrative and eclectic is basically that integrative is the understanding of those theories, those modalities, how they kind of mixed together, whereas eclectic is kind of like a toolbox, using things in an ad hoc way, just pulling out what feels right at the time. It doesn't concern itself with the potential theoretical conflict between the two models or the various models used.
Yes, you could have something called theoretical integration, where you're studying two models and effectively building a new model out of that. Or you can have what's called eclectic. It was explained to me that eclectic was a little bit like tomato soup. If you think of integrative as when you get your tomato soup, it's blended together, it's lovely. You can't separate the tomatoes from, all the onions or whatever you put in your soup. Whereas eclectic, if it's not done properly, is just like putting the raw vegetables and water in a bowl and handing it to someone. So you have to be thoughtful when you do blend two theories together. The advantage of eclectic therapy is that I think at the assessment, someone comes to you and says, I'm having really difficulty with social anxiety. It may be a CBT approach that's needed. So you can put the focus on that. But it is interesting. There are some disadvantages to blending theories, and one's theoretical kind of dilution. So, if you've got the theories that we study and the theories that have been around for 50, 60 years are well researched, well evidenced, and if you start diluting them, you may very well dilute the effectiveness of the therapeutic approach. And also it can produce, I think, a bit of conflict within counsellors, because they're having to work with effectively two different sets of languages and two different approaches. If you think of person-centered therapy, it's about emotion, it's about lived experience, it's about phenomenology. If you're thinking about CBT, it's about thinking, it's about, if you like, kind of contrasting your what you think, what the reality may be. It's sometimes about confronting difficulties. So I think that sometimes people who practice eclectically may have those conflicts, which is the best route to go down with a client. But a lot of people do practice eclectically and integratively. And of course, there are lots of courses that are integrative courses.
Yeah. You've spoken there about maybe some of the criticisms of the model. And I guess one of the main benefits is that you can be flexible and have a dynamic approach when you're working with someone who's coming in, so with a client. And if you've been face-to-face with a client, you'll know every single client is different. They bring themselves in there. They bring who they are and their journey. And being able to kind of tailor how the therapy runs can be a benefit for some clients.
Yes, and in fact, it links on to pluralistic therapy, which is probably another podcast, where, it literally is about absolutely working with what the client wants. I think that one of the things we have to consider is when we're offering this menu of therapy, like if you went into a restaurant, it's fixed. It's a fixed menu. This is a person-centered dish. This is the CBT dish. We can put those two dishes together, but that's the dishes. With more pluralistic approaches, it's a bit more a la carte. The client can choose exactly what they want and take it away. But I have done a little handout for this to just highlight the advantages, the disadvantages, what integrative means. And if you go to podcast 141 on our homepage, counsellingtutor.com, just click that little tab that says podcasts, and you'll find it in the show notes. You can click and download as Ken calls it, a super duper handout, and you'll be able to outline what are the advantages, what are the disadvantages, what actually integrative means.
Yeah, I just want to highlight the benefits of actually, after listening to our podcast and going to our website and having a look on those pages, is we put a lot of links in that are relevant to the discussion. So one of the links that you will find, if you go to counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab and go to today's episode 141, you'll get Rory's super duper handout. It is there for you free of charge. You pop in your email address, we'll send it for you. But we've also got a link on that very same page to a real article on our Counselling Tutor website that covers integrative counselling in some depth. It's written by one of our academic researchers and writers, Erin Stevens, who qualified in integrative counselling. And there's also another download you can get on that page as well, which is kind of 4 different types of integrative therapy. So we really can get some more depth just by going to the podcast page, go to the show notes, and you're going to get the additional information there. But there, hopefully that has kind of shed a little bit of light on integrative counselling. And also, if you dig into podcast number 14, so that's really going back in the podcast archives. Rory and I did speak of integrative counselling there as well. So you can get some more information and just fill in those blanks, get a real good overview of that.
Yeah, did you have to dust the cobwebs away in the archive?
I did. I was blowing the dust off it as we went. So there you have it. And of course, the Facebook group is where this all kind of happens. Get onto Facebook, put in Counselling Tutor, come and join in the discussions, ask your questions, suggest your topics for our podcast, because of course Rory did mention this topic actually did come from that Facebook group. So moving, I guess, away from integrative therapy and moving to standardization and the standardizing of assessments. This is CPCAB, and you spoke with Heather Price, Rory.
Yes, and I think that we pulled the curtain back a little bit and looked into how awarding bodies standardise their assessments. So I think it's really useful. And as Heather will outline, standardisation of marking to make sure that one centre and another centre are marking in the same way and delivering the theory and the content in the same way is just super useful, and certainly a benefit for employers, because ultimately, qualifications equal a road to employment, and a standardised approach, as Heather outlines, was very, very useful.
Let's check in with CPCAB.
Check in with CPCAB.
I'm with Heather from CPCAB, and Heather's going to be talking today about standardising assessment levels. What does that mean, Heather?
Well, I guess it means making sure that tutors all across the country are standardised, are working to the same levels, the same minimum standards everywhere, and that there isn't a tutor in one place marking much harder than a tutor in another place in the country on the same level of course. So we need all tutors to be marking to the same level or similar levels to make sure that the minimum standards are being adhered to, if that makes sense.
Yes. So there is a standard that's, if you're doing a level 3 or a level 4 or a level 5 or a level 6 course, there's an academic standard that has to be hit. Yes. And I guess the standardization is making sure that everybody who teaches on, say, the level 4 course is marking to the same level. They're not making it more difficult or maybe even making it too easy.
Yes, that's right. And we've got different ways of going about doing that. And it starts where we ask for the CV of every tutor who is registered with us to deliver a CPCAB course. So we need to see the CV, which details that tutor's background in terms of teaching, delivering courses, and in terms of counselling. And it differs for each of the various levels, 2 up to 6. So that's the first thing. The tutors send in their CVs and we approve them, or not, if the case may be, if they make sure they fit the standards that we want for the tutor delivering that particular level of qualification.
Yes. So the answer there is that the tutors need to be well enough qualified. They need to be practicing. They need to have experience of being therapists in their particular therapeutic discipline to be able to have the knowledge that allows them to understand and teach and mark the curriculum that's set by CPCAB.
Yeah, that's right. And then once they are approved by us and they're on our database for whichever level they've applied for, then we run what we call standardization training events for tutors, mostly in the autumn, but we do a mop-up one in the spring as well. And tutors have to attend every 2 years. If they're new tutors to CPCAB, they have to attend in their first year of delivering CPCAB qualifications. After that, they have to come every 2 years, but somebody from their centre has to come every year. So they send somebody to a standardisation day, and we've got 2 in London coming up in just under a fortnight's time. So tutors come along to that day, they spend the whole day with us, and we deliver some general information about CPCAB, perhaps the way counselling is going at the moment, any kind of updates. And then we have a series of exercises during the day that they can take part in to help them standardise the level for the qualification that they are teaching. So we quite often include a piece of work, say like a journal entry or part of an essay or a case study, depending on the level. And we look at it together as a group and decide which criteria are met and which ones are not and why, and have that discussion.
Yes, because it can be that if you've trained under a different awarding body, or you may have done a different kind of course. It's essential, isn't it, as a tutor, and I speak as a former lecturer of counselling, that everybody's on the same page, and I think that everybody understands what constitutes the level of hitting the criteria. And what needs to be said. That's what I say to my students. What you need to say to be able to get to the criteria. And it sounds like you show exemplars and you have a discussion around how the criteria is actually hit.
Yes, yeah, that's right. So we have what we quite often call criteria clinics. So we will look at a piece of work with some just suggested criteria numbers on it, and then discuss as a group whether we think that piece of work meets those criteria or not. And the usefulness of it is actually discussing, well, if it doesn't meet the criteria, why doesn't it? What else would we need to see there, which would mean it would meet the criteria? And that's where most of the learning is, really. And there will be a spectrum. There is a spectrum, but as long as everybody understands what the minimum acceptable level is, then that's what we're looking for, really.
Yes, and I think there's another reason that the standardisation is important, because of course it links to employment, doesn't it? Employers will want people with qualifications to have had a standardised education, in that if someone's employing someone from Bournemouth or Bath, I think it's called, they have actually hit the criteria in the same way.
Yes, absolutely. I think in a way, university courses, each university has perhaps got its own way of doing things and its own standards, and people kind of know, oh, well, that's a good university or that's an easy university or whatever. Well, we don't want that with CPCAB qualifications. We want any centre and every tutor across the country to be assessing to the same standard.
Yes, it's very, very important. Because, when you think about it, certainly at the higher levels, people will be working with clients. They may be seeing clients. Everything we do as therapists is aimed in the service of the client. And that's why it's important that when anybody qualifies, be they in one part of the world or another, that they're at the same level. And that we can, as tutors, I guess, make sure that people have the relevant understanding of therapeutic interventions, certainly in things like skills and, in all aspects of it, really.
And I guess another way that we monitor this is that because we mark the external assessments at head office, or at least we've got a team of assessors that do the marking, we can tell from those if there are any centres that are really underperforming. It might be a one-off, or it might be a series of that, and we can then follow that up by talking directly to the tutors or through our EV service, the external verification service. And that's another way where we've got people who work for CPCAB but are not tutors around the country who go into centres and look at the portfolio work. They wouldn't change anything, but they can say to the tutor, well, you are marking a bit hard for this level, or actually you're undermarking for this level. The standard needs to go up a bit. So they do get feedback from the external verifier as well. And we also have a system where each centre needs to have what's called a moderator, or some centres call it a second marker, who will look at not necessarily the whole group, but samples of the group. And they will second mark or moderate those samples that have already been assessed and give the assessor feedback that they are on the right lines and their standard is okay.
Yes. So there's just many ways of looking at assessments. It just isn't at the awarding body end, it's internally within the training institutions, and it's also by visiting external verifiers who come in and will have a look at maybe a bigger sampling, see a lot of the portfolios, which allows a really good overview of how a centre's marking, how they're really treating their students, how they're kind of marking with their students, making sure it's fair and reasonable, and also it matches the rest of the training centres throughout the country. It's clues in the name, really. It's standardisation, isn't it?
Yeah. But I think a lot of this goes on kind of behind the scenes, and students don't necessarily know that these things happen. And they kind of see their tutor, if they're say on a level 2 or a level 3, their tutor marks their work, and they think perhaps that nobody else is involved. Whereas in fact, these processes are going on behind the scene. So it's not the tutor just delivering and assessing in total isolation.
Yes, and I think that's reassuring for anybody who's taken any form of a course to know that it's not just their tutor who's making the marking calls, that there's a number of people involved in it, and that makes it fair, it makes it transparent, and it makes it universal, so that when someone does get their qualification, they have got something that is worthy and can be used anywhere in the country. So that is just so useful, and I'm sure that people listening will be fascinated about what goes on behind the scenes in standardisation. So Heather, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Check-in with CPCAB is proudly sponsored by CPCAB, the only awarding body run by counsellors for counsellors. To learn more about CPCAB qualifications and to get more detailed information on today's podcast topic, visit cpcab.co.uk.
That was super useful, wasn't it? And I think it really just highlights the fact that if you using the CPCAB awarding body, and I'm sure all awarding bodies do this, but we're talking about CPCAB specifically, that if you go to one centre and are trained, the training is just as thorough as it would be if you went to another centre 50, 60 or even 100 miles away. And I think standardisation is a really good thing. It came in when I started teaching, because one of the things that was being highlighted was people were being educated at one centre and educated at another, and they had two different levels of knowledge. And when Ofqual kind of came in, the British government's exam department, if you like, for want of a better word, they said it had to be standardised. And I think that's a really good thing, because it means that if you're moving from place to place or town to town, an employer or someone who's going to take you on knows that your qualification is just been taught in the same way as someone had been taught down the road. So very, very interesting and very relevant. And also, I think, quite reassuring, Ken.
That brings us neatly onto our next section, which is Practice Matters. This is where Rory and I delve into, I guess, being a qualified practitioner, what you might face as a qualified practitioner. There's a great need for continuing professional development. You hear us speak about that all the time. And I think often continuing professional development is misunderstood in that you're only going to learn about new presentations or new ways of working. But CPD is also looking at how you manage your practice. And every single session that is held by a counsellor has an ending, whether that's planned or unplanned. And today, we're going to be digging into the management of endings.
Practice matters.
Yes, I think it's interesting. I'll pick up on what you said, Ken, about CPD, not just learning about new things, but refreshing ourselves about the things we've already learned. So I know when I go through some of my lectures, I go, oh, I'd forgotten that. And, oh, yes, if I go through my back catalogue and look at the lectures I've delivered. And endings, as you rightly said in the beginning, Ken, is one of the biggest complaints that ethical bodies get. I know our friends at the NCS have a page outlining that endings is something that is an ethical consideration, the National Counselling Society. And one of the things that's really interesting is endings can depend on your own attachment style. So when I taught, I would say to people, if you're at a party, what kind of leaver are you? Are you a leaver that leaves just quietly, doesn't say anything to anybody? Or are you a leaver that has to go around and say bye to everybody? Because I think that will filter into how you end other relationships and the counselling relationship. I also think that endings should be planned. Getting the client ready for endings is just so important. And therapy should be, I think, it should be acknowledged that at some point therapy will end. So if you're working with fixed sessions, if you're in a placement or if you offer fixed sessions, then you will be talking about endings. But also I think if you're a private practitioner, sometimes if you haven't got that, the constraints of just so many sessions, I think sometimes you can pick up from the client when they're going to end or when they are ending. Sometimes they come in and they don't have anything to talk about. And sometimes bringing endings into the conversation is really, really useful because sometimes it gives permission for clients to say, well, I think I've had enough, but I didn't like to say.
100%. And I kind of, when I was lecturing counselling with you, Rory, one of the exercises I used to use with my learners was I used to say, think about a time when you've kind of been in a conversation or somebody's popped round to visit you or something like that, and for you, the end had come. You needed them to go. You'd had enough. It was time for them to go home now. But they carried on talking and talking. How did that make you feel? And then think about that in counselling as well. How might it be for a client who is coming in and that permission for that ending is not being given and it's going on too long? It's unpleasant. So endings need to be addressed. And you mentioned that the importance of addressing the ending. And I always say you need to speak about the ending in your very first meeting with the client. You acknowledge the ending, specifically if you have a fixed number of sessions, you're working in a practice where you are only able to, say, offer 6 sessions, you're going to be speaking about the ending of counselling in 6 sessions' time as you're doing your contracting. But even if it's not that and you have open sessions, it's still a good idea to mention the ending right in that contracting stage, mentioning to the person, and when you feel that you've got what you needed out of counselling, please let me know, and then we can start working towards the ending. Or if I pick up that you maybe are in a different place to when you came in, we might start looking at the ending, and then that will of course be over to you in your decision.
Yeah, so when yes, that's absolutely right. And also I think we've talked a lot about endings from the client's perspective. I think sometimes unsatisfactory endings can be where a client just doesn't return. Someone's had a really good relationship with the client. The real work has been done and seems to be ongoing, and then one day the client just doesn't turn up again. And I think that unsatisfactory endings with clients, therapists sometimes need to take that to supervision, but also it may stir up unsatisfactory endings in a therapist's history, which of course is a trip to your own personal therapist to process that. So I think you have to be aware of that as a therapist. sometimes we can get caught with unsatisfactory endings if a client just decides not to return.
Yeah, and of course it's the client's right to end that therapy at any stage. It's their therapy. They're coming in for their personal journey, and I guess there is that element of they just didn't come back. Everything seemed to be going right. The sessions felt to me as the counsellor like it was going well, and they just didn't come right. And we can be kind of start looking at ourselves. What did I do wrong? Did I say something inappropriate? And all that kind of stuff. So as you say, Rory, get that out to your supervisor, and look and examine your own attachment styles, I guess, in terms of what endings mean to you. How are you with endings? And then on the planned endings of therapy, which is kind of what we would hope for. The 3 stages of that are to assess the client's readiness to end therapy, and there are many different ways to do that. And then acknowledging the relationship, because it's not just the counselling therapy that is coming to an end. You've sat and built a relationship with this client. It's not just, oh, right, the sessions are over now. It's that relationship, that depth, that trust that is coming to an end as well. So definitely want to be acknowledging the relationship, and then thinking about how you can empower that client in their journey forward. Do you need to put in any referral pathways or kind of give any support to empower them in their resilience as they kind of go forward at the end of their sessions?
Yes, there's a lot to be explored in endings. I recently delivered a lecture on endings, and there was so much to consider. And as I say, as you rightly say, Ken, it is about client readiness and making sure the client's ready to end. And sometimes endings can come in different forms. Maybe that a therapist becomes unwell and has to end. It may be a therapist just has to step out of practice, and that's something to consider. But endings, they are the most important thing, I think, one of the most important things in therapy. And talking about endings, Ken, we've come to the end of this podcast. You see what I did there?
I did. But before we kind of log out, we can't cover a topic like endings without mentioning that you, Rory, you've done a really in-depth lecture on endings that kind of covers the different kind of endings, planned endings, the stages of endings, unplanned endings. And that lecture is part of our paid-for resource for qualified therapists called Counsellor CPD. And if you're interested in Counsellor CPD, it's continuing professional development for a qualified practitioner. You can find out more about that just by going to counsellingtutor.com. That's our mother website, and information is there. Just click on I'm a qualified counsellor and all the info is there.
Well, thanks for that, Ken. And wow, what a podcast. We started off with integrative therapy, what it means, positives and negatives, advantages and disadvantages. We caught up with Heather from CPCAB, who talked about standardisation. And then we finished with managing endings and quite an in-depth discussion on it. So, as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.